This has to do with the Old Testament prophets. In other sense, we are trying to survey the books of the Old Testament prophets in their chronological order, one by one. But before we venture into that, we have to understand the whole phenomenon called prophecy. The whole phenomenon of prophecy in the ancient world and also in ancient Israel. That's the first thing that we do. Human beings are naturally curious about their future, what's going to happen in the future. They also sometimes want to know what happened in the past so that in order to explain what's going on in the present. For example, many Hindu brothers or those who even Buddhists, they believe that the past karma is having an impact on what's going on in the present. So they want to know what are the things from the past that impacts their present and will impact their future. And people are very eager to know, and sometimes they are fearful to know what will happen in the future as well. So, since they themselves are not able to find out answers to all these questions, they have lots of practices. And these practices are not only ancient, they are also found nowadays. Modern people also resort to such practices. For example, clairvoyance. Clairvoyance or clairvoyant is a person who claims to know that he or she has a special ability to see things that others can't see. Now, they can transcend the human sense, natural senses, and see, hear things that others cannot see. And in the Old Testament or in the Bible, they are called seers, S-E-E-R, people who are able to see or a special sight. Sometimes people use divination, that is, use objects and their special shapes or things like that and predict the future or even the past. For example, in the ancient Rome, people used to magicians or witchcraft, people who practice witchcraft and other things, they used to cut open animals and birds and look at their internal organs and say whether a king should go for war or not go for divining. And there are various types of divinations that are possible. Some people consult tarot cards. Some people go to mediums or people who have special knowledge or special, ability to advise us. And mediums may be in ecstatic, they may have an ecstatic emotional state where they prophesy things, they predict things, they tell you about the past and things like that. Necromancy or consulting the dead to know what happened in the past and sometimes what will happen in the future. So there are people who claim that they consulted the past, our ancestors, our parents, dead parents, and who like that, and all that. Prophets belong to that category in the ancient world. But they are very different, slightly different at least. I would say they are people who tell others, their clients, what the will of God is. They claim that they are speaking on behalf of the divinity. They are spokespersons of the divinity. And these practices are modern. These are practices are found nowadays also. Many people go to astrologers. They consult their horoscope. They go to necromancers, people who consult the dead. And they bring the dead and then they see the dead. We can't see and they tell us what happened in the past, what is the problem, what's a curse in the family, and all that. So even now this is practiced, but it is as old as human civilizations are. However, the Bible is strongly against all this. In the law of Moses, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 to 22, strongly, in very strong words, prohibits such things, the pagan practices. And especially Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 14, which I would like to read, it says, for these nations, that is the nations that you are going into, you are going to possess Canaan, and in Canaan you will find these nations. These nations which you are about to dispossess, listen to fortune tellers and to diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do this. So, and then there is a list of various practices later on. So the Lord prohibited God's people practicing or going to clairvoyants, diviners, tarot card readers, mediums, necromancers, and people who claimed that they speak on behalf of God. And we can see that even in the revivals, we can see one of the aspects of revivals in the Old Testament is to cleanse the land of these evil practices. For example, around the 7th century, when King Josiah revived Israel and centralized the cult and cleansed the land of all the idols and idol worship and all that, his activities included in the book 2 Kings 23:24 says, Josiah put away the mediums and the necromancers and the household gods that is used for divination and idols and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, that he might establish the words of the law that are written in the book that Hilkiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. Not only there, we can see that the ancient Israel, the people of God, actually prohibited, and they were against, or they were supposed to be against, these sort of practices. This we can see in the prophetic criticism. The prophets stood against these practices. For example, take two examples from book of Isaiah. One of the sins of the people of Judah was that though they were ardent worshippers of Yahweh, they have also had all sort of fortune tellers and astrologers and things like that in the land. Isaiah chapter 2 verse 6 says, for you have rejected your people, O house of Jacob, because they are full of things from the east, and fortune tellers like the Philistines, and they strike hands. This is act of an occultic act, hand with the children of foreigners. And in chapter 8 of the book of Isaiah, verse 19 says, and then when they say to you, inquire of the mediums and the necromancers who chirp and mutter. That means they are in an ecstatic, they're in a trance, and they say ineligible words. Should people inquire of their God? They should not be consulting mediums and diviners and necromancers, but they should go consult their God. So these are practices that met some psychological needs of anxiety, eagerness, curiosity, fear, or even greed to succeed in life or to make profit, and which is the best way to invest, and where to sell and when to sell and things like that. These were prohibited in Israel. And why? There are various reasons why God prohibited such practices in Israel. First, the cruelty attached to it. This is basically to better your life at the expense of others sometimes because of your greed. Sometimes these practices involved human sacrifices and sometimes self mollification, hurting yourself, making cuts and wounds and having some sort of things through your cheek and going into a trance and all sort of things. There's a cruelty. Secondly, or most important thing, I should have said that first, it distracts people from the true knowledge of God, the true knowledge of the living God. And it creates a false religion of greed, cruelty, and exploitation and injustice. And moreover, these practices, that's the most important thing, is that there is no moral challenge. When you go to a necromancer to consult your ancient ancestor who died maybe a century ago or maybe a few decades ago, the necromancer will tell you what the ancestor know after consulting the dead ancestor. They claim, I'm not saying it is true claims, but they will not challenge you to live honestly, uprightly, and love others and share your resources. There is no moral challenge in any of this. This is self-centered. You and yourself. So, prophecy in the Old Testament is very, very different. Prophecy is these sort of practices are not allowed because of these all sort of negative things, evil, wicked things that are attached to it. Moreover, such practices doesn't make people a better people or to follow the living God. Instead, it distracts them from it. Now, though these sort of things are not allowed, prophecy was there in Israel. Prophecy has a long history. What is prophecy? Prophecy is when a person speaks on behalf of God. When a person claims, there can be true claim and there is a false claim. People can falsely claim that they are speaking on behalf of their God. We are not talking about that. These are called false prophets. But in Israel, we see this movement or prophets, a movement of prophets, a steady stream, a whole array of prophets extending from the very beginning even to the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is called the book of prophecy. In the book of Acts, we meet prophets. Even Saul was one of the prophets in the church in Antioch. So this is an ancient background all the way through the Bible till the 66th book of the Bible. So we are just going to survey the history of this movement in Israel. In order to study this, we will divide this into classical period and the pre-classical period. Let me explain what we mean by classical and pre-classical period. Classical period, or we call the classic period or the classical prophets, is that period where the prophets, the ministry of the prophets are recorded in the books bearing their name. That period is what we call the classical period. For example, book of Isaiah. The book of Isaiah records the life and the message of Isaiah against his historical background. So what is pre-classical then, or non-classical period? A non-classical period is the period when we have records of the prophecies or the activity of the prophets, but it is embedded in historical narratives. These prophecies are not collected, codified, and presented in the form of books bearing their name. So this is what we call classical period and the pre-classical period. Let me repeat again. The classical period of Israelite prophecy is the period when the activities of the prophets, their life and their messages were codified or collected into books bearing their name. That is a particular period from a period. But before that period, which we call pre-classical period, these oracles were not actually collected into books bearing their name, but they are these life and their account of their life and their messages are embedded in historical books. Examples of classical prophets are Isaiah. Let me say this. The period of classical prophets begins with 8th century BC. The period before 8th century is what we call the pre-classical period. So classical examples of classical prophets are Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Amos, Micah, Zephaniah, and all those books where we have books bearing their name. But this does not mean that they wrote the books bearing their name. And I'll talk about that at a later stage when we come to the classical prophets. This course will only deal with the classical prophets. We'll be surveying the books that the prophetic books in the Old Testament. Let me go to pre-classical prophets. As I said, the pre-classical prophets, their prophecies, we have stories about their activities, and we have some of their oracles or the message. As I said, these are embedded in the historical narratives, particularly in the book of Kings and Samuel and the Chronicles, and even Judges. So these books actually contain the activity, but there is no standalone books in their name. We can also look at this divide into further to the period before Judges and the period of Judges, and then the period of the united monarchy and the period of the divided monarchy. I'll give you some examples first of the period before Judges. In Genesis chapter 20 verse 7, God says or tells Abimelech that Abraham is a prophet. Abraham is considered as a prophet. And in many senses, he is. In the book, in Genesis itself, he received a prophecy about the fate of Israel, his children, to be born to him. They will become a big nation, and they will be slaves in Egypt for more than 4 centuries, and God will bring them back, and they will possess a new land which God has promised to Abraham. So Abraham received some insight into the future, what God is going to do with his people. So Abraham is called in Genesis chapter 20 verse 7 a prophet. In a similar way, Moses is also called a prophet. In Deuteronomy 18:18, God says, I will rise up a prophet like you later. So Moses is considered to be a prophet. And you know that our Islamic brothers, the Quran calls all these people as prophets. That's a tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition, which is reflected in Islam as well. And now that is about the period before Judges. And during the period of Judges, we see many prophets. One prophetess that we meet is Deborah. Judges chapter 4:4. In Judges chapter 4:4, Now it says, now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. Now, Deborah is one of the judges of Israel, but she also was a prophetess. What did she prophesy? We are not sure. But in Judges chapter 5, we have a song of Deborah, which doesn't have any explicit futuristic elements. But does that mean does that qualify her to be a prophet? Probably yes. And in Judges 6, verses 7 to 10, we read about an unnamed prophet. Judges chapter 6, verse 7 to 10. When the people cried out to God when they were oppressed by the Midianites, God sends a prophet. His name is not mentioned. And he prophesied that deliverance will happen. God is going to send deliverance from the Midianites. And in the later narratives, the verses that follow, talks about how Gideon accepted God's call and fought for Israel and delivered them from the oppression of the Midianites. So there is this unnamed prophet who spoke on behalf of God, or who spoke God's will for the oppressed Israel. In the same period, we see Prophet Samuel as well. Prophet Samuel was a priest, or he began his career as a priest, and he was also a judge. But 1 Samuel 3:20 says that he was also a prophet, Prophet Samuel. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. Now, the incident of the lost donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, Samuel was able to tell Saul and his servant that the donkeys that strayed away from his father's house, they are found. So was he and he's called a seer, someone who can see things which others cannot see. So during the period of Judges also, we see this prophetic movement. It actually begins in Israel with Abraham, who had visions about the word used there in Genesis chapter 15 is the word used for prophetic insights. So he is considered as a prophet, and God calls him a prophet. God calls Moses a prophet. And when they came to the land of Canaan, and when they were ruled by or governed by various judges in various areas who rose up time to time, there were prophets also among them who brought the divine counsel, what God's plans for his people are. The unnamed prophet and Samuel stand out among them. Now, after that, Israelite history passes to a new phase. That is, Samuel had to anoint a king. That is, Saul was anointed as prince, and but he was almost a sort of a fugitive king. He didn't have a permanent capital. We had to move from one place to another because of the Philistine threat. And but under David, all the 12 tribes were organized as one kingdom. Now he was king of Judah in Hebron, and the people of the north, the 10 tribes, comes to him and says, why don't you become, after Saul's death, you want to become the king of... The period of monarchy are the period or the reigns of David and his son Solomon. During these reigns, the 12 tribes were united under one monarchy, that is the King David, and after him King Solomon. So this is the period that we call the period of united monarchy. In this period also we see at least 3 important prophets. It's important to study or to know about their ministry. is very, very important because that has bearing upon the later prophetic moment. The first person, the first personality is Nathan, Prophet Nathan. See, you can read about him in 2 Samuel chapter 7 and around 7 onwards, you will see. He appears on the scene to encourage, to give an oracle about his dynasty and his rule. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, when David wanted to build a temple for the Lord, God speaks through Nathan that it is not he who will build the temple because his hands are full of blood, in the sense he has fought many battles and killed many people. So it is not he who will do it, but it will be his son, who is Solomon, who is a man of peace. So, but God speaks through or reveals his will through prophet Nathan in 2 chapter 7, where he is assured a sure dynasty, a dynasty which will rule forever. He will have a descendant. And so this prophecy was given to him through Nathan. But though Nathan was a person who encouraged or God used to encourage David to give him a promise, same Nathan was condemned David. You know the story in 2 Samuel 12, when David became a victim of his lust, and he plotted to kill Uriah in order that he can take Uriah's wife Bathsheba. Nathan comes to David using a parable, convicts him of his sin, and he also pronounces judgment. In 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 10, now because you have done this cruelty, killed a man and has stolen your wife, which is against the law of the Lord, and you have displeased God in this matter, now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. See, look, the prophetic movement has made a shift now. It's not only just to encourage people or just to give neutral oracles about God's will, what God is going to do in the future, like the unnamed prophet or Samuel did some prophecies. But that is not the issue. That is not only concern. The prophets are like two-sided coin. On one side, they speak words of encouragement from God for the good things that the king does or the people does, and at the same time condemns the king as well for his wrongdoings. We can see the same thing in another prophet called Gad. Gad and Nathan were probably court prophets. That means they were paid by the court and they stayed in the court as probably part of the royal staff, the cabinet even, who advised the king. Now Gad also has the same thing. When David was a fugitive, moving from one cave to another to save his life from the bloodthirsty Saul, and he was living in the caves in the Judean wilderness. It is God, the prophet, who met him and told him that he should return to Jerusalem in 1 Samuel 22:5. That was a good, wise advice when God told him to do that. God was a prophet. And that is why David had a career as a king, because after that many things turned in his favor. Then he became the king of Judah, then he became the king of all the 12 tribes, and he established as a dynasty. God was instrumental in it, the prophet God. But once he was secure in his throne, David was tempted to take census, count the people, how many people he has in his kingdom. Then purpose was to tax the people so that he can levy a tax on them, some sort of tax to create revenue. That probably was the intention. But that was not the will of God. That was against the will of God. So the same God who encouraged David to return to Jerusalem and not to live in fear of Saul as a fugitive in the caves of Adullam and various other caves too. Though the same God, but the same God comes to David and condemns him. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, we read about that. And it is a parallel in 1 Chronicles chapter 21 to 17. So this is the prophetic ministry during the period of United Monarchy. Now, when we come to the end, towards the end of the period of United Monarchy, after the death of Solomon, the kingdom disintegrates into two pieces, the northern Israel, which is called Israel, and Judah, the southern two tribes of southern. Towards that end, here we see another personality, that his name is Ahijah. Ahijah, when the people were going through tremendous pressure, economic, social pressure, because Solomon had enforced labor. He had a sort of slavery. He had made people to work on his different building projects. And he made enslaved people, you can say. And Jeroboam was in charge of that forced labor force. And Ahijah, the prophet Ahijah, a Shilonite, he is the one who instigated Jeroboam to rebel against Solomon, and later against his son Rehoboam. In 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 29, we read about it. Ahijah meets Jeroboam, and then he utters a prophecy. But in order to confirm his prophecy, he takes out his cloak, the dress, that is the cloak, outer cloak that he was wearing, and he tore it into 12 pieces and gave Jeroboam 10 pieces and said, the Lord is giving you the 10 tribes of Israel, northern tribes, and you are going to be the ruler for them. Actually, Jeroboam, a trade union leader, we can call him that way, because he was in charge of the forced labor, and he was also a person who tried to negotiate with Solomon and with Jeroboam, and probably tried to create a trade union struggle or something like that, a strike or something, a revolt maybe. But Ahijah is the one who encouraged him. And he also gives him a prophecy that God is going to establish him as a ruler, and he will a dynasty similar to what Nathan told David. But when Jeroboam sinned, when his son was sick, he sent his wife in disguise to Ahijah to inquire the will of God. What did he say? He condemned. In 1 Kings 14, Ahijah condemned Jeroboam for his idolatry and all the ungodly practices. So here you see in Nathan, God, and Ahijah, we see prophets confronting the kings, the rulers of the land, to encourage them, sometimes even to anoint them or to commission them, and also object and tell them the will of God when they were wrong and condemn them, pronounce words of judgments against them. Now, the monarchy was divided because of Jeroboam's revolt and Rehoboam, son of Solomon's foolishness. Jeroboam revolted with his people with the support of the laborers, and they said, "We have no share in the house of David." And they established a separate kingdom, and northern Israel came into existence with 10 tribes of the north, and 2 tribes of the south became the kingdom of Judah. This is a period, and they were never united. Except in the days of Josiah, after Assyrians had the province of Assyria, when Assyria was weak, it seems that Josiah extended his power there. But the 12 tribes were already disappeared after the Assyrian invasion in 721. Now, in the period of divided monarchy, from there onwards, it's called the divided monarchy. In 721, the northern kingdom disappeared, and 597 and 587, the kingdom of Judah also became part of the Babylonian Empire. The dynasty died, in the sense, came to an end. But during this period also we see prophetic movement. For example, Elijah the prophet, who challenged Ahab and Jezebel, and his disciple Elisha, who also worked in the days of Jehu. And then we read about another prophet, only just a very, a cameo appearance of a man called Micaiah in 1 Kings 23, whom the king of Israel and king of Judah, Jehoshaphat, consulted. So during that period also, we see prophets. But none of these prophets have a book bearing their name. That is why they are called pre-classical prophets. They are not called classical prophets. They have no book bearing their name. But they have a common feature. They guides the king, even Elijah. And Elisha too. Elisha anointed Jehu. They critiques as well. But another thing that we can see, that they had social concern for the poor. See the ministry of Nathan. When a social injustice is done by David, he condemns David. When David tried to exploit the people by taxation, by taking a census as a first step, God condemned him. Elijah condemns. Elisha did the same thing. And so they have a concern for the poor. Elijah ministering to the poor widow, and Elisha ministering to the widow of the prophets, and things like that. Elijah criticizing Ahab when he killed Naboth and confiscated his vineyard. And these people laid the foundations of the classical prophecy. We see, when we come to classical prophecy, that is our main concern in this series of studies, we see that these concerns are carried on. This tradition continues into the 8th century prophecy. Now, in the next lesson, I'm going to talk about the classical prophets. But before I move into that, let me share you with some common features of what prophets in Israel are. That is, including the classical prophets and the pre-classical prophets. First of all, Israelite prophets were not just fortune tellers, speaking about what is going to happen. in future. They were not, their job was not limited, their mission was not limited to that. They were intercessors as well. They are the people who interceded for the people of Israel. When Abraham and Abimelech had that confrontation, when God told Abimelech, that this man is a prophet, you have taken his wife, and says he will pray for you. Return his wife and he will pray for you. And then Abraham prayed for Abimelech and he was healed, and his household was healed. So Abraham is a prophet. He did not make a lot of prophecies. No, nothing like that is recorded in the Bible. But he is a prophet because he is an intercessor. He prayed for his people. Not only for his people, the whole world in a sense. Abimelech was a foreigner. Moreover, when God told him that he is going to destroy Sodom, you know that famous story. We are not going into the details now. But Abraham mediated, interceded, or in a sense he bargained, asked God not to destroy Sodom. And he laid conditions after conditions after conditions and said finally, he could not find the 10 people who are faithful there, godly there. But because of his intercession, God rescued Lot and his family and his daughters from that fiery furnace when Sodom went up in smoke. Abraham, as a prophet, was an intercessor. Similar thing about Isaiah too, Prophet Isaiah. We can give examples from the life of Jeremiah too. But let me see the book of Isaiah. When the king Hezekiah was surrounded by the Assyrian army, and the Assyrian commanders were making fun of him, ridiculing God and King Hezekiah. Hezekiah sent his messengers to Isaiah and asked, please pray for Jerusalem. So in Hezekiah's thinking, Isaiah was a man of prayer who can intercede, a prophet who can intercede for Jerusalem. So they were intercessors. And they had a special knowledge or conviction, I would say, of history. History is not a series of events which naturally happens. That's how the world takes history. But the prophets of the Old Testament believed that history has a director, a great orchestrator, and that is the God of Israel. God of Israel directs the history of Israel and also the history of the world. We'll see that when we come to individual books of the prophets, how this understanding. And also they have a special politics. Their politics was not an ordinary natural politics. Their understanding of politics was different. They understood, or they were convinced that God is king. He is the one who ultimately or finally gives the verdict on political events. So you cannot imagine statecraft, running a state, running a monarchy, running a country with ignoring God. So that was their understanding of politics. It is not the monarch who rules, but God reigns. We'll also see that theme when we come to individual books. Another unique feature of the prophets of the Old Testament, the Bible, is this, that they had a very serious concern. They were seriously concerned about the ethical and moral life of the people. They are supposed to live according to the covenant that Moses gave. God gave through Moses on Mount Horeb. That is, they are concerned. They should be concerned about the poor and the widow and the aliens and they should not exploit people, and all these concerns are paramount in the prophetic message. See, it begins with people. We can see this in the ministry of Elijah and Elisha. Elijah, who feeds the poor, who raises the dead of the widow, and Elisha the same thing. They're concerned about the poor. They stand against exploitation. I already mentioned that. When Naboth was assassinated and Ahab confiscated property, that was serious social injustice. And he stood against that. He spoke against that. So this is another thing that we see in unique prophecy. Don't imagine prophets as fortune tellers. And when we come to the book of prophets, we have to come with that knowledge that don't expect a lot of future and only future. But their concern, their knowledge of history, the way they understood politics of the world, and their ethical and moral. But the most important thing about prophets is they had a terrific sense of being called by God. Not only called by God, but sent by God. We have in most of the books, and some books it's only implied, it's not very explicit, what we call narratives. The account of how God called them. Isaiah was called by God, Isaiah chapter 6. Elisha, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and all these prophets have, and even Amos says, I am not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but God took me from following the sheep or pasturing the sheep. God took me. I am not a professional prophet. So here is this call of the prophets are called. The Bible also says that the false prophets or people who claim that they speak on behalf of God, behalf of Yahweh, they are not called. So how do you tell a false prophet and a true prophet? A true prophet's claim of that he is called by God is true. But a false prophet falsely claims. One or two verses I would like to read. One is Jeremiah chapter 14:14. And the prophets, and the Lord said to me, the prophets are prophesying lies in my name. I did not send them. I did not send them, nor did I command them to speak to them. They are prophesying to you a lying vision, worthless divination, and the deceit of their own minds. We can see the same thing in Jeremiah 23 verses 21 to 22. I did not send the prophets, yet they ran. Without God calling them or commissioning them, sending them forth, they ran. I did not speak to them, yet they prophesied. So here we see the true prophet and the false prophets. A true prophet has a tremendous sense of being called. That is why, at least in a few cases, there is a call account, an account of their call, sometimes very detailed account as well. We can also see that they also refuse. For example, take the case of Moses. When Moses was called and God said, you have to go to Egypt and bring my people to this place to worship me. Moses did not say yes immediately. He refused. He had all sort of excuses. He said, I am slow of tongue and things like that. He was not willing to go. In a similar manner, Jeremiah, when he was called, he also had excuses. Why did they, when God called them, why did they happily take it up? Why did they refuse to take it up? Why did they reject his offer? The reason is simple. They knew what they are taking up. They knew the seriousness of their task. This is a job that nobody wanted to do. Why? Because as when Jeremiah was called to pull down and to build up. He was given a word of judgment that Israel has no hope. They will go to Babylon. Finally, they will return from Babylon, but the present Israel, present generation will go into, God is going to punish because he had spoken through various prophets from so many years. He knew his message will not be accepted. So that is why he refused to take it up. Moses knew the seriousness of it. That is why they refused to take up that challenge. Now, the most important thing I said is that notion, that self-assurance, the conviction that they are people who called by God. But yet, they were compelled to take it up, though they never wanted it. If they could, they would like to get out of that task. Now that pretty well summarizes the prophetic movement and the prophets of Israel. Please understand that when we read the book of prophets, we are not going to meet fortune tellers who speak about the future. They do, but they had other things as well. They were trying to call people back to God, back to his laws, back to an upright and righteous life. So, in the weeks to come, as we go through the books of the prophets, we'll realize that. It will open our minds to new realities that sometimes we have overlooked. Here we end today's lesson, today's study on the prophetic movement in the ancient world and its peculiar expression, manifestation in the life and the history of the people of God that we know from the Old Testament. Tomorrow or the next series, whenever it is, we'll be looking at the prophetic books in general before we venture into survey or detailed study of individual books. God bless you.